Thursday, June 22nd, and it's the third day of Design Week here at Media Day. Wanted to briefly cover what the other half of our aesthetic is, our design perspective. Spent a couple of days filming the classical perspective, the origins, the DNA, the fundamentals, the substance of our design mindset that has to do with the classics, with classical typography, with the great printers, with the overlap between book printing and web design, going to the sources, going ad fontes, and basically sourcing our inspiration in a huge way from that. But there's a half of it that is not from that, because if we just went in that direction exclusively, then we'd be basically making designs that look like books. Obviously that's not what we want ultimately. And even if we said, all right, let's mix it up, let's add some images or some graphics to it, we'd have to invent the whole theory of how to do that. And nobody here is ready to create a theory of that at all. So the question was, just like with the classics, if they didn't exist, we'd have to create the theory. Thank God we didn't have to create the theory. Just so with incorporating images into design, what does that look like? And instead of creating the theory, the better question is where do we go to find the best exemplars of it, of what we want? And that's the same question. Where can we go to just pilfer from the inspiration and the examples and the aesthetic that's already been made, and use that to learn the lessons and build on that to build the Media Day aesthetic? And so the answer is Apple. Steve Jobs, to be specific. Not Apple as a company for all of its time, because who knows what that means, but really specifically this Steve Jobs aesthetic is something that I'm really coming to appreciate in retrospect, because I took that in the beginning, okay, as a foundation purely intuitively. I was into Steve Jobs and I was like, this guy's got the answer for what we're looking for. Everything was incorporated that could be incorporated from that side of the world of life. And only by sort of providence did he exist, and nobody else has existed that can be anywhere near what he's done for design specifically. Specifically for UX, UI design, the visual interface development. Interface design. Johnny Ive was big on hardware, is big on hardware. He designs beautiful hardware pieces, but Johnny Ive is not a great software designer, let's put it that way. He's not a great UI designer at all. So when he got promoted in recent times to being both a UI designer and a hardware designer, as if he could do both, as if both were the same thing, he's failing in the UI department when he won awards in the hardware department. So he's not at all the source of what I'm talking about. It's really Steve Jobs, and perhaps to some extent Scott Forstall, who was fired immediately from Apple once Steve Jobs died. So there's a lot of question of who was the actual down to the ground specific originator, but I still would say it is Steve Jobs, because even if he wasn't the physical bricklayer, he was definitely the architect of what I'm talking about. So I give him the full credit. Anyway, so what is the Steve Jobs aesthetic? You have to see it. It's really hard to explain, and I'm not really going to spend the time to film it have a lot of things to do today. Today's going to be a very busy day, so no 20 minutes filming, Apple designs and things like that. But in a nutshell, what that means to me at least is, number one, layouts that focus on clarity. Number two, layouts that emphasize being intuitive. Organization, content, strategy that is intuitive, more than creative, more than look at me, look what I can do, and so less of that and more of you don't even see it, and it just works. It just works. Like that was a key phrase for him. It just works. Or words like intuitive were big for him, huge, when he was alive. That's what he used a lot. Things like merging liberal arts with computers. Things like when he described the Mac team, the first Apple Macintosh team, he said these were people that could have been poets and painters, and instead happened to work in computers. So there's that incredible, interesting overlap between everything he's done and what I've talked about. So that's definitely at his foundation as well, to some extent. But then you merge that with graphics that there's a sense of tangibility to his designs. There's a sense that you can touch and almost feel the work that he's designed together. Like he's created something physical and not virtual. And a lot of things go into that. So a lot of things that are today, I'll put it this way, in 2012, 2013, when I was really just first coming up with all of this, the Apple design was everywhere. But like text shadows, buttons having shadows, reflections on shapes in the website world. The website world was aping Steve Jobs tremendously. Certain UI and button arrangements that were intuitive and sort of tried and true and sort of accepted in the culture as the vocabulary of user interfaces. And it basically came to be called skeuomorphism. It was this clunky word that means almost nothing. And it basically ended up becoming, once he died, once sort of the Microsoft style of flatness and blocks took over, and the Steve Jobs inspiration for his work disappeared, and people in his company were no longer left having faith in his work, they switched over to the flat design of Microsoft and then Google to some extent. And so now they've become flat as well. So there's a thing called flat design, very similar to minimalism in architecture, believing in aphorisms like form follows function in interface design, in a website design. You can't have something that doesn't have a specific function. In architecture, this led to a demise of beautiful ornamented buildings. It led to squares and rectangles in architecture. It was destructive to an incredible extent, and it led to the same exact result in the digital world. And computers and technology is much more difficult to use today than it was 5 years ago. I believe that. And so when Steve Jobs died, and they fired his number one associate on interface design, Scott Forstall, they put Johnny Ive in charge. He was a purely hardware guy who believes in form equals function. And so he was an evangelist for that maxim big time in Apple. They became flat, and so they lost everything that made the Steve Jobs Apple aesthetic work. They lost all the shadows, they lost all the gradients, they lost all the reflections, all the chiseled effects, all the tangibility. The phones became much less tangible, less physical, much more abstract. And so we at Media Day may be one of the last few organizations, if not the last, in the country, maybe the world, that not only adheres to this Steve Jobs aesthetic, but almost seeks to revive it, seeks to be a champion of it, seeks to be a castle and a fortress of it in the modern world. And so that's kind of the thing for us. We combine, Robert Estienne, Claude Garamond, with Steve Jobs. We combine 1541 with 2012. That's the vision. That's the vision. The vision is to be very desperately classical, deeply drowned in timeless concepts and divine proportions and theology of design as it's supposed to be in an absolute sense. Design in an absolute sense is what the classical typographers espouse. And then making that incorporate imagery and, like modern headlines and sort of the environment, the fishbowl of the computer as presented by the Steve Jobs aesthetic. We combine those two things and we get something that's timeless, we hope. I'll put it this way, we hope to get something that's timeless, that is universal, that is absolute, that is objective, that is innately attractive to the human eye, intuitive, delightful without knowing why, sort of no frills beauty, sort of something that just is good without you knowing what it was that made it appealing to you. Something that's tangible, something that's physical, something that's concrete, as well as abstract. So super abstract and super concrete, super tangible, super relatable, and that is what we believe, and that is what we build at Media Day.